Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Wednesday, October 29th, day 754 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our editor, David Horovitz, joining us from the Jerusalem office. Hi, David. Thanks for joining me today.
Sure. Hi, Amanda.
The IDF announced this morning that the ceasefire in the Gaza Strip is now once again in effect following a series of significant strikes targeting dozens of Hamas targets and operatives. The strikes came after Palestinian operatives carried out an attack on troops based in the Rafah area in southern Gaza, killing an Israeli reservist soldier. This strike on IDF soldiers, along with Hamas's failure to return the deceased hostages' bodies, is leading to Israel to claim that the terrorist organization is not upholding the Trump peace plan. We'll discuss all of this and more when we're back.
What are we supposed to do and say and be during this time? Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Texting IRL, Ideas for Real Life, where we grapple with the dilemmas of the Jewish people through the lens of classical and modern Torah texts. So in this special series, we're going to examine a number of different angles.
Judaism has so much complexity to it and so many layers to it that no one layer stands by itself.
V'hevei dan et kol ha'adam l'kav zechut, and judge everyone to the side of merit. So even before we delve into what Maimonides is going to do here, I'm curious how you interpret these three pieces of guidance. Kind of a Rorschach test.
We have to find opportunities to make enemies into friends.
I mean, I think it's hard right now, but it's some of the stuff you talk about on the show a lot, which is coalition building, listening very hard, not giving up.
The model is so majestic in this text.
Welcome to Texting IRL, Ideas for Real Life. I'm your host, Alana Steinhain.
I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our editor, David Horovitz. So Hamas again reminded the world that it is a terrorist organization as a casket that was handed over by Hamas on Monday night to Israel contained the partial remains of Ofir Tsarfati, a hostage whose body was recovered by the military in early December 2023. And in addition to not returning the bodies of any of the 13 dead hostages still held in the Gaza Strip, Hamas staged a faked discovery of Tsarfati's remains in eastern Gaza in front of the Red Cross. So I think it comes as no surprise that Hamas is a depraved terrorist organization, but I think the couching of it, as I've seen in international media, at least surprised me in terms of when Israel decided to retaliate for both the lack of the return of the deceased hostages' bodies and, of course, the strike on soldiers in Rafah. But David, what are we hearing so far from the White House, for example, in terms of Israel's ability to retaliate in this situation?
Yeah, the American line, the president himself, his vice president, is that this ceasefire is, it's back in force as we speak now. It sort of came back into force about an hour ago. Israel has basically said we've retaliated and we've hit back as we needed to and saw fit to do. The Netanyahu government also made clear that they had told the Americans that they were going to hit back after the order to do so was given, but before the response was carried out. I think that's very interesting. In other words, I suppose there was room, had the US said this is just unacceptable and terrible threats were being leveled at Israel, there was still time to call it off. But Netanyahu was able to say, hey, you see, I'm not taking orders from the Americans. I gave the order first and then I told them. That's a very interesting kind of middle ground. And the context is a Trump administration and a president that does not want this ceasefire to fail. Indeed, far more than that wants his plan to advance through to its 20 steps, as unveiled on September the 29th, with Netanyahu accepting it at the White House. There was a subsequent deal. The Trump plan was not signed. The agreement that was operative was signed in Sharm el-Sheikh, including by Israel, by Hamas, and it doesn't provide for further phases of the plan. And it's slightly different in terms of what Hamas was obligated to do. In all plans, Hamas is obligated to return the hostages. It returned all the living hostages, as we know. It was supposed to return all 28 deceased bodies. but there was wiggle room in the operative plan. In the October the 9th plan. If they didn't have them all, well, there was more time. Within 72 hours, either give back all the deceased hostages or all the information you have on those you can't return. And it's because of that wording that Israel is saying you violated the deal. You didn't return any deceased hostages in the 72 hours once the ceasefire went into effect on October the 10th. 4 were returned soon after the 72 hours were over. And since then, we're now up to a total of 15. So 11 more have been returned. And in the last week, none at all. And as you've spoken about there, the sort of depraved faking. You watch the video and nothing more needs to be said. They took a body bag that they had stored elsewhere nearby. They put it at the bottom of a very, very deep hole. They covered up the hole. And then they extricated it, dumped it to the side, were partially covering it up. The Red Cross arrived, and hey, look, we found a body. Well, it wasn't a body. It was. We don't get it. I don't want to get into the particulars, but essentially, the body was that, or the remains were that of a soldier who has been buried, whose body was extracted. So, parts of a body, we should say, and then they sent that back instead of the promised new return of one of the remaining 13 deceased hostages. And then they called off the planned return of another body last night because they were upset, basically. I think that Israel had exposed their despicableness. They said later yesterday they found 2 more bodies. Nobody believes anything that Hamas is telling us. And the only question is how this plays out. I don't think Netanyahu is inclined to destroy this ceasefire and incur the wrath of the White House. And I think Hamas is trying to work out how far it can push. Every day of a ceasefire is an opportunity for them to regroup further. There've been indications that they're trying to get more equipment into areas that they control with which to carry out nasty things that they do. I don't know if it's for direct attacks on Israeli soldiers or to do stuff in tunnels, but digging equipment, all kinds of things they're apparently trying to get their hands on. And therefore, we're at a pretty sticky moment. I think, answering you now, it seems that the Israeli-American position is certainly close enough that if the ceasefire can be sustained, if Hamas can be persuaded or can decide that it's prepared to return more bodies, then that's what's going to play out. If Hamas overplays its hand, Israel responds in ways that the White House is not happy about. I mean, there's lots of potential scenarios here. And I think maybe the last thing to say comes back to the beginning of how you worded the question, which is, people seem to lose sight of the fact that you're dealing with Hamas. Hamas attacked Israel. It killed 1,200 people in Israel. It took 250 hostages. It only returned them under intensive pressure in a quite extraordinary achievement brokered by Donald Trump, but it fully intends to survive. It wants to regain control of as much of Gaza as it can. It does not want to fade into the background. There will be endless tricks ahead if this process moves forward. It requires real wisdom and savvy and smart thinking to outwit an organization whose raison d'etre is to try and destroy this country and kill Jews. And therefore, when they do stuff that's horrible and despicable, and you couldn't even have thought about that ahead of time, nonetheless, you have to say yes, because you're dealing with Hamas, and it underlines the imperative to make sure these people have no future role in anything that can determine anything as regards not just Gaza, ultimately the West Bank as well, anything that goes on in this region. They are poisonous. And by the way, and we'll come on to this in a minute, they are sustained in their evil by countries including Turkey and Qatar that are taking ever more, or seeking to take, shall we say, ever more significant roles in what plays out in Gaza.
Okay, we will move to that in a second. But one thing that jumped out at me, I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but U.S. President Donald Trump said something along the lines of, if Hamas behaves well, it would be treated well, but it's behaving badly, and that they need to remember that they are a minor part of the peace in the Mideast. And that second part it seems incredibly significant to me, the reminder to Hamas that they are just one little link in this massive chain that U.S. President Donald Trump is imagining, or at least aspiring to. And I do wonder if Netanyahu took a little heart in that kind of comment. Of course, right now, U.S. President Donald Trump is set to meet with the leader of China. He has other concerns on his mind as well. But I wonder how long our Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, will be able to restrain himself, restrain the army, restrain his coalition from pushing back into war.
Yeah, so I think we all wonder. I don't think that Netanyahu would take particular heart in Trump saying anything about a role for Hamas, however minor. I mean, I think Israel would want to hear the American president, for whom they have tremendous, I would say, admiration. Most Israelis, certainly, for what he achieved in getting back those last 20 living hostages. I know I keep saying it, but it's a really big deal, and nobody thought it was going to happen. But Israel wants to hear, no, Hamas has no role, is a nothing. It has to be at least a nothing in the Middle East. It's not the only toxic and poisonous and death-seeking terrorist group, but it's the one we're talking about now. And if you want a stable and peaceful Gaza, and if you want change and improvement in the Middle East, Hamas can be nowhere. And the countries that support Hamas can be nowhere. They can't be. You can't have Turkey, which incites on Hamas's behalf, which calls Israel a terror state and Hamas legitimate. You can't have countries like that with those stated policies. You can't have Al Jazeera, funded by Qatar, peddling incitement, Hamas benefiting incitement across the world, not just the region. Now, Trump, that he's capable of, I don't even know what terminology to use, but he's capable of saying things in the service of near-term, very, very crucial goals. I mean, he accepted Hamas's response to his September the 29th 20 points as proof that Hamas seeks lasting peace. I mean, Hamas does not seek lasting peace, and that's not what its response said. But as a consequence of his determined branding of the caveat-filled, conditional, cunningly worded Hamas response, as a consequence of him accepting that as, hey, they want peace, we got the 20 hostages home. People who we did not, again, we did not think that all 20 of them would be coming home, because then Hamas would have given up its most potent leverage. And that happened. Hamas did give up its most potent leverage. Now it's trying to leverage the 13 remaining deceased hostages. And there will be other terrible things and terrible tricks, without a doubt, either in this short-term first phase, potentially short-term, or further down the road. But, Trump is looking at the big picture, and he'll say things that he thinks will keep things on the road to that big picture. And the bottom line, we had lots of arguments in Israel, but when Trump unveiled that plan at the White House on September the 29th, Netanyahu immediately accepted it. He didn't accept it as in, I'm saying that we're doing, he said, broadly speaking, this plan meets the goals of our war. It gets back all the hostages, it disarms Hamas, it demilitarizes Gaza. That's what all Israelis would like to see. So whatever Trump needs to do to try to get to that point, that will be very high in the thinking of a Netanyahu who's got a coalition, some of whose members want to go back to the war, and wants to go back to the war even before the latest. There were previous breaches and so on. But the big picture for all Israelis, or almost all Israelis, and certainly statedly by the Prime Minister, is to try to reach the implementation of that Trump plan. There are a few sentences in there that Netanyahu would not have chosen to write himself about, pathways and potential for a Palestinian state and so on. But broadly speaking, this is a vision that Israel wants to see implemented, and Israel will try not to be the party that prevents it.
I would say that big picture, Hamas probably does want a lasting peace. They just need to get rid of that pesky Israel first to achieve it. But one of the questions that many of our listeners have written to me about, actually on email, is if Israel knows the location of another, up to, we're hearing, 9 other hostages, why is Israel not just going in to get them at this point?
So I know your comment there was sort of ironic, but I think we need to understand Hamas to the further depths, which is if it were able to eliminate Israel, it would continue to seek to kill Jews everywhere else as well, and to encourage other people to kill Jews everywhere else as well. So even, stability in Gaza and peace in Gaza, that doesn't fully meet the Hamas agenda. In terms of why Israel isn't sending troops into areas that it doesn't control, I mean, that's the only conclusion you can draw. If Israel knows or knew that there were deceased hostages in areas that it does control, then of course those would have been brought out. So we're talking about areas where Israel is no longer in full control. It has a tremendous amount of intelligence. We are told over and over, not that Israel assesses, but that Israel knows that Hamas has many. I mean, any number of the 13, I've heard, we've reported Israeli officials saying things like 9 for sure, that we know Hamas could return right away. And in many cases, this is presented, again, not as an Israeli assessment, but as Israeli intelligence fact, right? We haven't seen the intelligence, but this is apparently what Israel knows. But you'd be risking soldiers' lives to try and get, we don't know the circumstances in which these bodies are held. We don't know, that little show that we all witnessed yesterday that was filmed on Monday. They're capable of digging down very deep. These extractions, and the IDF has carried out some extractions over the 2 years, as we know, are not simple. And Hamas does still have weaponry, and presumably any kind of significant extraction effort would be likely to lead to violations of the ceasefire, on either side or both sides. And for sure, you'd be risking soldiers' lives. You've got an agreement under which Hamas is committed. It is undeniably committed to sending back all the bodies that it has and handing over all the information on bodies that it claims not to be able to return. And then there are other forces that could play a role. There are Egyptian forces, the Red Cross is on hand. If that's not happening at the moment, it's because the circumstances involved in seeking to extricate bodies from areas where the IDF is not in control are presumably such that the risks are too great or the complications are too great.
I would agree with you wholeheartedly. And as the mother of a soldier who would be deployed to that kind of area, I definitely really prefer my son's life not be risked for that. And you have to see in these videos that we're talking about, for example, the Gazans themselves are surrounding the area and cheering on as the extractors are working. So there's a lot of public support for, or at least performative public support for Hamas in these areas as well. So it is definitely dangerous. That would be fully part of the answer there.
I think it's worth just taking a second there, because you put it in such a personal way. The relative risks, what you're prepared to do for which result, they're not the same when it comes to, there's a possibility to get a living hostage out. And we saw the army taking tremendous risk with, in some cases, fatal consequences, and in some cases, success, and in some cases, a mix of both of those. The considerations, the risk assessment is different when you're talking about bodies. There is no doubting that Israel is fully committed, and other families, desperate, as we've said before, for that worst of all phone calls that confirms the worst of all things, but still brings you the closure and the capacity to have a burial and a grave. But the considerations are different, and the expectations. I don't want to speak for anybody, but I think the expectations from most Israelis of what the army can and should do when it comes to deceased hostages are not the same as was the case when we were talking about the potential to save living hostages.
Let's go to a short break.
On October 7, I was here at the Nova Music Festival. I ran for my life, hid for 7 hours. Terrorists shot me twice. Thankfully, I survived. I'm still dealing with trauma, and I'm not alone. 3 million Israelis are in trauma. They need mental health care or physical rehabilitation. Wounded soldiers, families, and scared children.
Since 1912, Hadassah has been a life-changing force in Israel. Today, Hadassah has 2 world-renowned hospitals, pioneers breakthrough medical research, cares for youth, and has built the much-needed and largest rehabilitation facility in Jerusalem.
Thank you to everyone at Hadassah Hospitals. You've been helping me, and so many others. And a special thanks to one nurse My mom, I love you.
And Rebecca, I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our editor, David Horovitz. So even as the Haredi community in Israel is planning a massive protest at the entrance of Jerusalem for tomorrow, the Knesset is working to draft a bill that will allow most of the Haredi young men to skip the draft. But we're hearing that Likud MKs have come out against the current Haredi draft bill that is being discussed by the Knesset's Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. This committee itself has experienced quite a personnel shuffle in the past few months. So, David, weigh in here.
Yeah, I think the first thing we should state is that as of 11:30 on Wednesday morning in Jerusalem, we've not seen the text of the proposed legislation, but parts of it have been leaked, and I suppose fairly credibly, since multiple leaks, and since Knesset members who are familiar with the proceedings, some of them at least seem to be accepting the clauses that have come out as being genuinely planned, and some of them are pretty upset about it, and that's quite interesting. There are Likud Knesset members who, in many, many circumstances, will go along with things that the opposition, for example, will deem to be terribly damaging for Israel. There's judicial overhaul legislation, all kinds of things. But in this instance, including, there's a experienced ex member of the legal establishment, the state legal establishment, who's now Likud Knesset member, who has at least one, maybe more, I'm not sure, children serving in Gaza, certainly has had, really, really angry this morning about the wording that has come out. His name is Moshe Saada, and he says this is essentially a bluff. It's satisfy the Haredim legislation if it moves forward in this form. He doesn't think it will pass in the Knesset. The mathematics are complicated. He certainly thinks it will not clear the High Court, the Supreme Court, which has demanded that the government pass legislation to address the issue of the abiding non-service of ultra-Orthodox young men. It's not as though they're going to soon be exempted. No, they don't serve in the army. And the High Court has said this is discriminatory and unequal, and therefore you need to legislate to end this practice. And in fact, what the government is trying to do is legislate to enshrine this practice. And he says the terms are outrageous. A clear key point here, I think, is that the way this legislation is reportedly constructed, it will not bring more combat soldiers into the army from the Haredi community. It's potentially could see the drafting of, as he put it, more kashrut supervisors in the army. That's not what the army needs. The army needs, it has said it needs thousands of soldiers urgently, and it needs to adjust and make more equal the burden of service. As we know, you had reservists doing 4 or 5 more 100 days of military reserve service since October the 7th, 2023. And part of the length of the reason for the length that they've had to serve is that there is a limited number of people who are able to serve, trained to serve, required to serve, and that would change if the numbers we've heard, if something like 80,000 eligible young ultra-Orthodox males, if most of them were serving, then the burden would be reduced. And the burden is an incredibly heavy burden, including death and everything, less drastic than that, leaving your family, your business, your parents saying, my children barely recognize me because I've been away at the front for most of the past 2 years. So the equalizing of this burden, and this legislation does not do that in any effective way, and it maintains this exclusion. And what is interesting is that already this protest from unsurprising members of Likud, but still, this is not an easy thing for Netanyahu to square. How does he keep his ultra-Orthodox partners, some of whom are in the coalition, some of whom aren't, last time I checked, but essentially they are core to his bloc? How does he keep them happy without alienating other members of his coalition, without alienating vast swathes of the public? We're now into an election year in a way, because the election cannot be held later than about a year from now. Late October 2026 may well be heard earlier. That's the area where Netanyahu is probably most vulnerable. There are others, of course. He hasn't stepped down. He's blocking a state commission of inquiry. But in terms of people who would vote for parties in his bloc, this is the most problematic issue for him, because there are utterly contradictory positions from within his coalition. The ultra-Orthodox keep us out of the army. We're essential to Israel's defense by studying Torah en masse. And for example, the two far-right parties, Otzma Yehudit, Religious Zionism, much of the Likud, no, that's not how you en masse serve Israel. The best and the brightest, the legitimate full-time students, fine. But if you're dodging the army, well, that cannot go on. And it's an impossible issue to solve for him. And his dutiful head of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, who took over from Yuli Edelstein, who refused basically to legislate to Netanyahu's will. Boaz Bismuth, the new appointee, is trying to square that circle. It's not going to be easy.
Right. You talked about the voters who may, continue to vote for Likud or other parties that could form another Netanyahu coalition in the future. And just again, on a personal level, my husband and I were speaking about our children who are coming home tomorrow night from the army. And we were discussing how impossible it will be for our soldiers to return home because of this massive protest at the entrance to the city of Jerusalem. It's so ironic on so many levels. And many IDF soldiers become more conservative in the army. There's a lot of trend reporting on this. And you just have to wonder, are these soldiers who could possibly have voted for Likud, will they actually vote again for Likud because of this utterly personal sacrifice that they are willing to commit, and yet the coalition is not as a whole?
Yeah, I think that's, we will see how people vote. We will see before then how Netanyahu manages or doesn't to somehow keep all sides happy. You're talking about this demonstration yesterday we saw, or 2 days ago, we saw a protest. I think it was yesterday, maybe it was 2 days ago, outside a prison where some draft dodgers are being held. And the ultra-Orthodox protesters were wearing yellow hats, and some of them had yellow balloons. And basically what they have avowedly, declaredly said they are now doing is they are trying to emulate or echo the tactics of the families of hostages held by Hamas in Gaza, with mass rallies and even the use of that color yellow, as though their draft-dodging friends and they themselves, in seeking to preserve non-army service, are somehow equivalent to those held hostage by terrorist groups and in many cases killed by terrorist groups in Gaza. I mean, it's a foul parallel. There is no parallel. And again, if you want to alienate everybody else, then that's the way to go about doing it. And then add to the fact that your kids can't get home tomorrow easily because the entrance to the city is being blocked by these people who insist on not doing military service that your kids are trying to come home from for a Shabbat break. It's unbelievable.
David, thank you so much for your insights today, as usual.
Better times, Amanda. You know what? It's a little better than it was a couple of weeks ago. Let's keep remembering that.
100%. Thanks so much, David. Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow. Shalom.